Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. Today visiting me from down under, from Adelaide, is Amit Srivastava, who recently co-authored a fantastic book on the history of the architecture of India with my very good friend Peter Scriver. The history of Indian architecture that starts around 1947 with India's independence is a classic paradigmatic story of post-colonial architecture with its roots in the colonial period and with its foundational aspiration to become a great modernist event following independence, and then its critiques and revisions in the era of postmodernism and globalization. This is the story that we will rehearse today with Amit Srivastava and try and get into some of its lesser known microhistories. Here we go. Hi Amit, welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you, Vikram. Thank you for having me here.
So Amit, you with my very good old friend, Peter Scriver, at Adelaide, published this fantastic book called, well, it's part of the Modern Architectures in History series, which was published by Reaction Books, and they have a number of other histories which still keep coming out. And you guys did the India history and published it in 2015, a fantastic, beautiful book, very well laid out, 370 odd pages.
Yeah. I think it's one of the thicker volumes in that series.
It's one of the thicker volumes, and deservedly and properly so, because it is a beautifully written, very complicated and nuanced history of this period. So congratulations for this book.
Thank you.
And you have, 7 chapters in this book. You start around 1855, and as I can see, by your 7th chapter, you are even talking about since 1990, so since neoliberalism, if you like.
Yeah.
So you're covering this kind of 150-year period.
Yes.
And there's the colonial period, and then there's the sort of the late colonial, what you call complexity and contradiction.
Yeah.
Then you talk about the nation building period, which is, let's say, after independence in 47 under the Nehruvian period.
Yes.
And then the history becomes more complicated.
Yeah.
And I see chapters which sort of double back and forth in time.
Yes.
There is regionalism, institution building and the modern Indian elite, 1950s to 1970s. And then 2 chapters, one called Development and Dissent, the critical turn,
Yes.
1960s to 1980s.
Yeah.
And then Identity and Difference, the cultural turn,
Yes.
1980s to 1990s. First there's a critical turn, then there is a cultural turn, before, in the last chapter, we arrive at the non-modern,
Yeah.
towards the non-modern.
Yes.
Fascinating use of terms. Architecture in Global India since 1990. So that's the outline of the book as far as chapter headings was concerned. So tell me, at this very high level,
Yes.
what is we know the big story of Indian history.
Yeah.
Colonial, late colonial, modernism, festivals, Indianization, regionalization, and so on.
Yeah.
So how is your story recast or how do you see this history of architecture in India, modern architecture in India, What is your sort of particular take on it?
I think it's a good question to try and capture what the book is trying to do.
What
And
is its trajectory? Yes.
Yeah, and I think you've said the right thing where you say we all know the big story, and in a way, the big story is part of many other big stories about different parts of the world that have already been written.
Yeah.
So when you trace whether historically or stylistically, you kind of go, this sort of colonial, late colonial, and then this sort of modernist period followed by a kind of postmodernist sort of dabbling in regional concerns. This is a story that is not just about India, it's about everywhere in the world in that sort of sense over this period. So we are not trying to reconsider those timelines or change the big story.
Okay.
Right? The unusually thick volume is because we think that within that large story lies a lot of small stories that show the gradual shifts and explain how these things happened in the particular case of India, which might not be fundamentally same as any other part of the world,
Right.
And sort of show that while the rest of the world is moving in a certain direction, and India is as well, India resists it, and then eventually is complicit with certain things, and then manage to resist it further, and then catches up, and this sort of resistance and catching up creates the individual fabric of the country. So
the micro narrative, the smaller narrative,
exactly,
or all the supposedly smaller narratives.
So in that sense, it is hard to write a survey history, which is a large 150-year cycle, but then also be able to sort of say that we're not just following a pre-existing script that the rest of the world is doing. We're continuously challenging that script and say, hey, we don't want to be there. Maybe we don't want to be modern. Maybe we don't want to be, regionalist. Maybe we don't want to be postmodern.
And that was true in your book also, even in the colonial period. Like I really love, that church by Arthur Shoesmith. The solid brick St. Martin's Garrison in Delhi.
Absolutely gorgeous.
And Shoesmith was, I think, Lutyens' apprentice, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And Lutyens is doing this massive, strip neoclassical, Grand Projet.
Yeah.
But Shoesmith does this really weird church.
Yes.
Are these the kind of micro? Tell us about that project, and I see you have highlighted it in the book, and why?
No, I find that church fascinating. From a personal perspective, of course, I am a resident of Delhi. I grew up in Delhi, and I've seen that church before, and I have a personal interest in brick architecture, so that's how I first got quite interested in that church. But I think the story of that church is quite revealing of this sort of stories that get lost in the large narrative.
Yes.
And Shoesmith, who was helping Lutyens during the design of Delhi, actually took part in a couple of competitions for designing other churches in Delhi, which he lost out to other people who ended up designing, more traditional neoclassical facades. And the most interesting thing about the Garrison Church is that it has this sort of very bold, almost stark modernist kind of form to it. But particularly there is a letter exchange between Lutyens and Shoesmith, which is quite interesting, where Lutyens tells Shoesmith to use brick, okay, but and then I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact terms, but he sort of says not in a sort of way where you use it as a decorative element like the Queen Anne style or something, right? But in this sort of bold, robust manner. And
so this is a Lutyens directive?
Yeah, well, Lutyens write this in the story. Well, of course, it is still Shoesmith's design, but Lutyens is almost giving this permission to his apprentice to go against what Lutyens is doing, his mentor.
Really?
And he's telling him not to be stylistically governed almost like what Lutyens is kind of doing with his
Because
neoclassical
it's
stuff.
sort of a modernist thing to
Exactly.
use brick this way, isn't it?
And it is fascinating that Shoesmith is able to do that, and we're so glad that that project still stands in Delhi, and then we
I
can
mean, it's
see
sort
it.
of precedent to Khan in Ahmedabad, is it not?
Absolutely, it is, and
Massive brick.
the monumentality of it is very sort of similar in sense of talking about Khan's thing. But I think, like we were sort of saying about the larger story, I think these are the micro things which are quite important to understand, that while a major story might help us think that Lutyens is wholly devoted to this neoclassical endeavor, right? These are the stories that help you understand that, you know, our architects don't just follow one style blindly.
Right,
That
right.
there are this constant conversations that are happening, and the parallel streams coexist until a time comes when the other stream takes off and becomes mainstream. So, you know, modernism will become mainstream at a later time, but in that sort of final stage of British colonial period, there is this sort of give and take where they're not
Complicity
quite
and contradiction.
exactly
Joseph.
complicity and contradiction.
So who would be other sort of significant micro-historically important characters?
I think when we're talking about the colonial period, I want to reinforce the thesis, which is mostly out of the original work that was done by Peter Schreiber, is instead of looking at those individuals like Shoesmith, which of course make for a much more interesting story, it is the work that at an institutional level, things like the PWD continue to do, which is far more interesting. And where we are, on the one hand, completely blindsided by, you know, Lutyens' grand gesture and this desire for the colonial government to have this last hurrah sort of thing and produce these monumental buildings to establish its control over India,
Right.
you know, symbolically. Last attempt at that. At the same time, the PWD has been working for the longest period of time to create these buildings which would be clearly modernist at their heart, in the sense that they're
standardized, rationalized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that is more important, instead of looking for individuals again who might have sort of presented the opposite ideas to the sort of grand gesture. It is the consistent work of things like PWD that we are quite interested in, because we are saying, well, because they avoid those highlights, they can stay, you know, hidden and in the background and continue to do the work, which affects how the nation's sort of approach to architecture and construction develops over a period of time. While people like Lutyens come, they make a lot of big splash, but then they disappear just as quickly as we kind of did.
So how does this continue after independence in 1947 in the Nehruvian period? What are the sort of micro narratives and the sort of institutional presences?
So I think the PWD is an interesting case, and in the book we carry that thread as far forward as we can, mostly because even though India gets independence, while all of this is happening, a lot of the structures of governance and things continue or are inherited from the British and continue to maintain how the new country is going to be governed, even though by new sets of people.
The
but using the
PWD
same.
is still important.
So the PWD continues, and then we get newer people who are heading the PWD, and a very important story in that is one of Habib Rahman, who becomes the chief of the CPWD. And his work is really interesting because he brings this particular flavor of modern architecture, but not as a single name private architect, but almost an anonymous player within the bracket of the PWD. So he does this sort of Gandhi Memorial in Calcutta, which has this interesting, you know, combination of a temple and a cross and everything, which is using the kind of modernist intent of simplified formal language, but still responding to concerns that, interestingly, even in the 90s with the Ram Janmabhoomi context, he brings back again. The other interesting thing to also observe is by early 70s, we also have the Architects Act.
Yes.
Okay,
Pilo Modi Architects Act.
So once the Architect Act comes into position, the professional sort of status of the architect is affected by this as well. So then the establishments of the urban arts commissions and a whole lot of other institutional frameworks come in. So the profession goes in a slightly different direction, and we can now see PWD as being one player compared to other institutional players that are affecting how the built environment is, or dictating how the built environment will develop.
So you think the Architects Act gave a significant boost to private practice in India?
It's not the act, I'm just sort of saying that the act is a marker to recognize that there is a discussion within or about the profession which gets some legitimacy.
Right.
So it's not just the act that happens. I'm just sort of saying that the early 70s period is also the time when a lot of the urban arts commissions and stuff are established, and there's an institutional understanding of what private architects and others can contribute to the process. So this is also the time when Korea becomes the chief of SIDCO in Mumbai and stuff. So what I'm saying is that the PWD becomes one player amongst others who are starting to define.
Why was there this shift to the more private sector?
Well, the assumption, of course, is the change in the political and economic structure, of course, and the recognition that the country moves in a different way. But we have to recognize the 50s and 60s were a very special time. You know, people like Nehru weren't just leading a country in the general sense of being a prime minister as one might be today. These were deeply affected by personal networks and how you knew people and who you communicated with. So all of these things were deeply affected by the circle of influence between the elite households and stuff.
Of course.
And when we're talking about, the princes who still held so many parcels of land in India, trying to sort of, negotiate a deal with how they want to be part of the country, and the whole discussion around the States Reorganization Committee in 1955 and all of those sort of discussions. It's a very different time.
Right.
By the time we get into early 70s, we are finally getting to define India as a nation state in that sort of sense, and Indira Gandhi is very forceful and specific about that, and sort of she cancelled all the princely private privies and all that, all that, and really tries to pull together the nation under her sort of socialist model. So it is a massive change. It's a time of massive change in India.
So you and Peter describe the 60s to the 80s as the critical turn.
Yes.
And the 80s to the 90s as the cultural turn.
Yes.
So tell me, what is the difference between the critical turn and the cultural turn?
Okay, so the important thing to notice is that the chapter that says development and descent, the critical turn from 60s to 80s, is also to be seen in relation to the one that precedes that, which talks about regionalism, institution building, and modern elite in the 50s to 70s. So we sort of talk about 50s to 70s as one period, and then 60s to 80s as one period to show that overlap. So in that previous chapter, when we talk about regionalism and institution building and the elite, we are talking about the role that was played by regional elites in defining their regions
versus the central national,
versus the center's attempt to try and put something together as a nation, right? So if we sort of see the post-independence Nehruvian period as an attempt to build this sort of nation, we kind of present that other chapter as a resistance or a retaliation to that process, where the regional elites are trying to boost their own regions in spite of what the center might be trying to do.
So what's an example there?
So, of course, that particular places where places like Ahmedabad become quite important in that story. But we also have stories where we start looking at the establishment of things like the Birla Institute of Technology and,
Pilani.
Yeah, so all of this sort of stuff that's happening, and then
and there is Chitle also, right? I mean, Chitle's work in Bangalore.
But Chitle, of course, is an architect. We were talking about characters like Birla, for instance, who, as regional elites, are trying to boost their region, and in the process of doing that, in the process of establishing institutions, like we already know in Ahmedabad's case. Ahmedabad acquired IIM, acquired NID, neither of which were supposed to be based in Ahmedabad originally. It was acquired to boost Gujarat, which was recently formed as a new state and had separated from the Bombay presidency.
Okay. I'd never connected those things.
So to make Gujarat a state and to recognize that it is not just a leftover from the
Bombay.
division of the Bombay presidency into Maharashtra and Gujarat, which was of course based on language as a division, basis of division. So they managed to acquire large national institutions like IIM and NID, and then gave the commission for the architecture of these to important people, which helped, bolster them as the center of,
So that's the
cultural
regionalism chapter.
So
So what's the critical term?
so what we talk about is that when there is the center trying to do something and then the region retaliating to it, there is a phase we find particularly in when we say 60s to 80s, mostly sort of focused around the 70s, where there is a recognition that there has to be a way to bring all of this stuff together, right? So, we can't have this separation between the center and the state to continue. So we have a lot of pieces of work in that chapter. We talk about a lot of pieces of work in the 70s where, how should I put it?
There's the establishment of the sort of private architectural elite class at that time.
Absolutely, it is. But
Korea, Doshi, Raval, Jain, all these people.
But there's a conversation that starts. So, for instance, in the early mid 70s, the conversation that we have between the new architects who have sort of come back and are getting into the profession with the center around things like housing and stuff. Become quite
housing is a
important.
big question.
Absolutely, yeah. We also start seeing at the same time, projects like the Dudh Sagar, the projects like the Pragati Maidan and all of these sort of things, where the intentions that we originally saw with the elites in the regions, right, are now being combined with what the state wants to do, the center wants to do, to create a combination where it would sort of say, well, this is Indian architecture in that sort of sense. So an example we have is the Dudh Sagar project, for instance, by Kanminde. And we kind of talk about how it is taking on the agenda of, the nationhood in one sense, but also the state in another, because it recognizes art from an architectural perspective what it needs to do, but it's trying to develop a national institution in this sort of cooperative format with, working on the white revolution and all of that. So there's that sort of connection between the industrial aspect of what it wants to be, but then as we often talk about the Dudh Sagar project as the horns of the cow, and then there is this sort of symbolic aspect to it as well. So we start seeing projects where we have this sort of mix that is starting to develop between this sort of industrialized Nehruvian view of what India needs to be and the regional desire to be expressive in their own sense and not lose what they might define as being part of India.
Right. So it's sort of a critical modernism, really.
Exactly. And then we also introduce at the same time, certain things that are kind of harder to place in that center region sort of conflict is like the Matri Mandir and Auroville and places like that, which is a very fascinating story in itself. So which
is sort of outliers, sort of the micro strange stories.
Exactly. So the capacity of something like that, which is not trying to retaliate to the center to create some sort of this regional elite response, but on the other hand is very international and is affected by all the things that are happening around it. So it's an interesting and fascinating state. So critically, we kind of present it as sort of saying, well, we can use modernist architecture and modernist ideas, but that doesn't need to mean that we essentially lose what it is to be here in India, and respond to the local context.
So then what happened in the 80s and 90s when we got the quote-unquote cultural turn?
So the 80s is, of course, a lot of the stuff in the book relates to political changes that are happening. And 80s is, of course, an important time for India, mostly because it follows the period of the late 70s and the emergency, where there was a media blackout. India is operating in an environment where the outside media doesn't quite know what's going on the inside. And for better or worse, there's, very strong political controls on things that are happening, which create retaliation within the population to what the government is trying to do. But leaving all those particular details aside, what happens is the specifics, of course, mean that there's a double change of government in India, and Indira Gandhi comes back in the early 80s. But the fascinating thing about anybody who's read anything about Indira Gandhi and Congress's history will know that the Indira Gandhi that comes back in the early 80s is an entirely different person than that of the early 70s. And with people like Pupul Jayakar and stuff on her panel, we start seeing this this version of Indira Gandhi which is supporting almost quasi-religious kind of relationship with the Ganga and with the cultures and arts and things like that. And we start seeing, as a result of that, things like institutions like IGNCA eventually emerge.
Right.
So that has its impact. Okay, but also internationally, there's a lot of stuff that has happened. So if you look at international tourism industry, for instance, in the 70s, there is a particular change where we go into cultural tourism, which starts becoming a way for countries which are not economically well off to then, which are not industrially forward, right, to have a source of income. And and this sort of cultural tourism becomes another thing. So what we think in the 80s, the most interesting thing that is happening is that India takes upon it this need to project a sense of well-being and solidarity to the outside world after the media blackout of the 70s, right? And so we start seeing things like the festivals of India and stuff emerge, which is India proactively putting forward a sense of being India and being good and happy and being together. And so the festivals of India start traveling, and we go to Sweden, we go to the Soviet Union, we go to the US, and there's this overt desire to represent India through its arts and cultures as this wonderful sort of diverse, but you might remember the unity in diversity.
But touristable place.
Yes, but of course there is that economic concern as well, because if you make that the cultural, if you commodify it, then it introduces the possibility of people to come into India. And we find within the chapter it does start happening in places like Orissa, which are quite opposite of something like Gujarat, which is highly industrialized and has been quite economically stable because of its industrialization since the colonial times. But places like Orissa, which are on the eastern belt, right, which are not industrially that sound, they start doing a lot of stuff around promoting tourism, right? And then that becomes a way for them to be part of the economic structure.
But basically this fails, right? This cultural turn, and we end up with liberalization.
Well, and again, no country is isolated, and there are global things that are happening. And while India is going through its own sort of problems, and we sort of see issues that are developing by the late 80s around because of this, like I described the cultural thing as quasi-religious originally, kind of has a very strong religious problem that emerges, and by late 80s we also have on one hand things with the Mandal Commission and stratification of society, and issues that are emerging from that, and on the other hand we have what eventually leads to the Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi crisis. So those things are happening, but at the same time the Cold War is coming to an end. The world's sort of abandoning this sort of the two world format. So yes, the 90s is a very, and technologically, there's so much change happening. So yes, the 90s is a very different period where all of these things collapse.
Right.
But it's not just India, though. It happens globally. So
Right.
in the end, it affects India as well.
Right, this is probably a good time for us to take a break. We are talking to Amit Srivastava. He's visiting here in Seattle from Adelaide, where he is a professor in architecture. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Architecture Talk. This is a self-supported podcast based on an initial grant from the GAHTC. For more information about GAHTC, please visit gahtc.org. We release a new conversation every other Wednesday. So, if you're enjoying this conversation, please do be sure to visit our website and to check out some of the earlier conversations. From the website, you can also subscribe to this podcast and you can listen to the other episodes. You can also simply directly subscribe to us via Spotify or via the podcast app on your iPhone. And of course, we are available to be heard via any of the other podcasting apps that are available on the internet, such as Stitcher, Overcast, etc. We would also love to hear from you if you have any questions or just some comments, or even have a suggestion for a future episode. You can reach us via the contacts page on architecturetalk.org. Thank you for listening again. And we are back and we are talking to Amit Srivastava, who is visiting us from Adelaide here in Seattle. So Amit, tell us about your current research. I believe you're working more on construction industry and construction history with focus on the contemporary world and its historical moorings.
No, I think, the word institutional is important. And to a certain extent, the word everyday is important as well. So it is stuff that happens every day, which constitutes and reconstitutes what
No,
the
but
field
it's
of
different from
architecture is.
quotidian, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you mean sort of how do big bodies put things together.
Absolutely,
It's not
yeah.
the architecture of everyday life as
No,
Del
but-
Upton talks about it or others talk about
but the relationship between that everyday existence and how these big institutions are working, because more often than not we forget that the everyday is so much affected by what the larger institutions are doing. So to capture the processes by which those things are mediating the everyday also means understanding how that mediates the agency of the individual architect, who we might sort of regard as a genius and sort of see
Right.
how they are. And it's not to sort of undermine what the architect does, but to recognize that what the architect does is not in this sort of isolation where, he sits and waits for a genius into sort of inspiration to come through, but that it's a sort of constant ability to deal with what the larger structures are doing, what the institutions are doing, and sort of responding to it. And maybe
so
that's
give me
where
an example today, like where you think this is a key thing to be looking at, the relationship between the broad institutional transformations. Like, is this sort of, are you talking about availability and control of steel, for instance, which constantly is an issue in the news?
Absolutely, yeah. So to a certain extent, it is about material and availability, which has an economic impact on certain things. And obviously, if something is too expensive or unavailable, it will possibly not be something that the architect chooses to work with because of economic constraints. But it's not just about economic constraints, it's also about the things that we celebrate. So for instance, you start celebrating a kind of architecture or a kind of material. So let's say we assume concrete becomes available, and suddenly there is this phase in construction where you're doing a lot of fantastic concrete buildings, and which then creates as a byproduct a whole series of other structures that maybe sort of in secondary situations, or the smaller towns or something, that people start emulating this, they're doing that. But in addition to exporting that architectural style, you also supported the use of this material, which then fuels the industry in a certain way. Certain other materials go out of phase, and their production becomes less lucrative, so less people produce them, and so on and so forth. So there is economic impact that is coming out of this desire to emulate certain style as well. So what I'm trying to say is architecture is not divorced from that.
No question
And
about
we had to understand that not just as a constraint, but also as how,
generative.
how in your sort of positive support of a certain kind of material, certain type of architecture, you are constantly changing the economic structure and
Right.
making some people more powerful, making some people less powerful, and so on and so forth.
So, but this is still history, right? I mean, you're a historian,
Yes, of course.
and you were telling me earlier that you're into construction history, and that you enlightened me that there are construction history conferences.
Yes, yeah. I think
Tell me about construction history and construction history conferences and.
Okay, so let me start with why history in this context. Because when you're looking for these sort of, I don't want to say subtle changes, but the changes that aren't obviously available to you if you look for the highlights, as you were saying, right? They only reveal themselves when you look at a longer duration.
Give me
So-
an example.
So, for instance, it's not about history as in a certain event that happened in history, but history as the series of events. So, for instance, if I was to look at architectural highlights, I would say in a particular period, neoclassical architecture was great, and then it went out of favor, and then suddenly people started doing sort of Bauhaus modernist stuff, and then that went out of favor, and people started doing brutalist things. So it just seems like certain events happened, and then there's some sort of zeitgeist which is making this happen. But a proper historical analysis with this would show how the transition from the use of stone as a primary material in neoclassical setting then transfers into other kinds of materials with steel and glass and stuff in a sort of Bauhaus modernist sense, and then transfers into excessive use of concrete in these large brutalist structures, and try to understand not just that from the perspective of the whim of the architect who's trying to capture an aesthetic style, but responding to the transition of
So
the
to a
economic
certain extent, that still sounds to me like a Gideon space, time, and history kind of a discussion, that there are new materials and there is new technology, so that produces a new architecture. But I think you're doing more than that, no? I mean, you're looking at sort of big institutional structures and how they sort of run.
So again, when you say new materials, where do the new materials come from, and what makes them more popular than what existed before? So in the current context, we sort of delude ourselves that there is some sort of scientific rationale where certain things are better, right? And so somehow if steel is better than stone, or concrete is better than steel in certain situations, you end up using that. But it also follows some sort of sense of objectivity and truth. The more you recognize patterns of human interaction in history, you realize that objectivity and truth are quite malleable concepts,
Right.
And so
No,
in
but
a
which
previous
is it?
context,
Is it like people decide to privilege certain materials and techniques and then sort of proselytize them? Or is it that there is a social milieu with a certain dynamic which ends up privileging certain techniques and materials of working, which then get sort of advocated for? Which is it all?
so you are asking if it is a decision of the people.
Is it sort of a social process which privileges certain things, or is it that there are CEOs of companies with certain vested interests that have a particular interest and therefore then they push it through?
I think it is closer to the latter, but maybe not quite as sinister. It's not like they're sitting in boardrooms going, ha ha ha.
I'm not sure.
we're
Maybe
not
they are.
the thing is that they are operating in a world where certain things have value. So, let's say profit, or what we kind of call this sort of myth of progress in a way. So there are certain social values that they can sell. So if they attach a material object that has value for them into the narrative, the social
Of
narrative
course.
around these things. So let's say, for example, everybody believes in progress,
Yeah.
scientific progress, human progress. Now this is a humanities concept, let's say, with the
Well,
idea that
modern
we believe-
humanities, yeah.
So historically, we believe we're moving somewhere, and there is progress that is happening. So if I now want to build an industry out of steel, and I can attach steel to this narrative of progress,
Yeah.
suddenly I can use that as a basis of changing people's views around using steel, let's say even in their homes, which is something that would not have been even considered,
Earlier.
earlier.
So that's fascinating. That's great. So do you see these narratives playing out, let's say, in contemporary India, South Asia, in that sphere, in the Modi India?
Absolutely.
So
I
examples.
think as a historian of the 20th century, places like India, and I can't speak for India because that's the area of expertise, but I would assume it would be possible in other similar places as well, are actually they're good case studies to try and understand this, because in the sort of post-colonial context, there are a lot of institutions that arrived in these places or thrived in these places within a short period of time because of the political context. So
you're talking about the Nehruvian period now?
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So the idea of rapid industrialization in the post-colonial context suddenly ensured that certain characters within the national sector had the capacity to develop larger institutions and build things and do things.
So who are you
in a way
talking
that-
about? What list these for me?
So we were talking about construction companies, for instance.
So Larsen and Toubro.
So we're talking about Larsen and Toubro. We're talking about Shapoorji Pallonji. We're talking about Gannon Dunkerley. So these sort of companies that really only started with, for example, Larsen and Toubro, just a couple of engineers trying to run up a small business, suddenly get this opportunity to become really big because of a country that's trying to rapidly develop its infrastructure. So
why did L&T suddenly jump into this versus others?
So L&T, for instance, only started as a small construction firm trying to support sort of government projects, but ended up getting a lot more support in trying to do things like airports and roads and things like that, because they were able to get the right technology and material from overseas, because of course both of them were European and they had all the contacts there. So that was a possibility. So once that happens, you start getting massive government contracts, which ensures that very rapidly in a context like this, you go from small to large scale. And once you're at that scale, in a situation like India and a third world developing context, there aren't that many policies or even precedents that define what you would do. So you become the basis for defining what happens within the industry at that scale or within that kind of construction.
Did the Ahmedabad mill owners mafia also play a similar role in Nehruvian India, or were they the people who lost out?
That's hard for me too, because the mills as an industrial foreman is not my area of expertise, so it's kind of hard to say. But when we start looking at, as we've done with the book, and we look at the larger context, we'll also recognize that the reason certain people are successful within the stream of construction is also because they're networked with other people who are successful within the industrial context. So there must be an opportunity. It's very early for me to say that, but there must be an opportunity within which the industrial elite within the context, like the Mill Owners Association here, would have provided the right networks and patronage and support for some of these things to happen. We already know that within the architectural case. For instance, people like Doshi and stuff have that possibility in a place like Ahmedabad because they have the right patronage. And
so you're saying globalization is working?
Well, globalization is working for some people in certain
Yeah,
contexts.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
of course.
No,
Yeah.
we're
But
only
it is
talking
working.
construction.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of construction
Yeah.
and its influence and construction companies' influence in the South Asian, Indian Ocean periphery rim sphere, as you are
Yeah,
calling it.
absolutely. Yeah. So
Globalization is normalized. Would you argue?
absolutely, the limits on national boundaries is something that, you know, as a historian, is something you struggle with all the time, because while politically and in sort of people's imagination these boundaries exist more strongly, when it comes, as we know, with stories of globalization, when it comes to trade, when it comes to understanding of technologies, of knowledge, you know, these boundaries are transgressed all the time, and, you know, things come in and things go out. Sometimes they're easily mapped, and other times they're not easily mapped. So, you know, these exchanges happen all the
What
time.
do you see, since you're based in Adelaide,
Yeah.
in this Australasian sort of construct? And we seem to, here in Seattle, in the US, it seems very far away.
Yeah.
And we don't really care about anything other than China and Japan.
Yes.
How would you describe the contemporary construction geopolitics, design and construction geopolitics in Southeast Asia? I mean, is like Singapore a big player, China a big player, or
Yeah.
India is the big player, or is it really just homogenized and flat? What is
No,
it?
I think it is quite interesting you mentioned the China thing, because yes, sitting in Australia, of course, China is an important player, and sometimes it's a bit frustrating working on India while sitting in Australia, because Australia is deeply concerned about what's happening in China. But I think the reason we talk about the Indian Ocean rim is that we see that there is just a subtle difference in the influences of these two major players. You know, if you look at China and India, there's slight difference in the regions that they influence. So that's why I don't use the word Southeast Asia, because China has a certain impact in its neighborhood, which is kind of, if we use more sort of older terminologies, more sort of Far East kind of story. And then there's this sort of Southeast Asia, which is an extension of China's influence. And then Australia is very much connected to that sort of more of the Pacific Rim story.
There's a Pacific Rim story, and then there's an Indian Ocean story.
The Indian Ocean Rim story, I think, is, we've struggled very hard to sort of, you know, come up with how do we talk about the areas of influence. And we say Indian Ocean Rim because India has a much stronger sort of connection with the Middle East, particularly in this sort of construction story. So when you start talking about places like Dubai and stuff, the presence of both Indian, and I want to say Indian, but it also includes like Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and South Asian labor and technologies and companies, much more stronger. So there's more of that sort of Western link, but also on the Southeast Asian side, on the Western front towards the Indian Ocean, there's more links here. But if you go further,
Western side meaning,
so we say it was some
Burma, Myanmar,
of course, but also Malaysia and a little bit Singapore in that sort of sense.
Indonesia a little bit.
But the further you go away into sort of, you know, the Philippine side or Macau or all those sort of things, of course, that is the Chinese influence. And of course, Australia continuously sees its relationship with that, with trading partners in places like Korea and Japan and China. That, of course, affects the Australian economy the most. So sitting in Australia is not particularly useful in that sense to understand the India story, but it gives us this interesting distance. And of course, we travel to India quite often as well. So it is an ability to get away from India to be able to look at the larger geopolitics of that. But yeah, I think that's what I would sort of say, that there is this very subtle difference in the area of influence.
I mean, there's a sort of a competition over Africa now.
Oh, yeah, I was just about to mention Africa.
Tell
and
us
that's where we are starting to get a bit more interested in, because China has sort of growing interests and has had actually been a lot of influence in Africa, some documented, some not so well documented. But of course, India has old ties with Africa, mostly because of migration and stuff, which meant that there's a lot of Indian population in eastern parts of Africa that exist from colonial times. And they have these bases of Indians in Africa have maintained trade connections as well. So when we're talking about places like Gujarat, they have continuous connections, strong connections. So those places in Africa still have a very close tie to India. And we find that when we talk about the Indian Ocean Rim, we are able to talk about certain parts of Eastern Coast Africa in that sort of sense. And that's why it becomes an easier way for us to approach Africa as well, rather than saying Africa as such, because China, of course, has influence there. So India's influence, I would sort of say, has had that sort of Middle East and Eastern Africa connection in that sense a lot more.
Okay, so that's interesting. Sort of, it's funny, very interesting for me that in the view from Australia, there is kind of like a split line up the peninsula, Southeast Asian peninsula. There's the sort of China zone, and then there is the India zone, which kind of seems to continue to mirror ancient meaning millennial old, 1,000-year-old zones of influence.
Absolutely. And I think we might have redressed versions of, let's say, make in India and this and that happens, and every political party has its own rhetoric that they want to put up forward. But any kind of reality that backs it has a longer term historical reference to it. So nothing is created overnight. These relationships only develop, of course, over decades and decades of connections between people and existing partnerships and trades and things that make people comfortable to share ideas. And
cool. So how would you describe as your sort of project now? I mean, you're getting into construction, institutional history. How would you describe this project that you and Peter are sort of embarking into?
Well, I think in method and process, it's not radically different to what you do with writing about architectural history. So you start with players, I say players in this sense because when speaking about architects, you can often say individuals, but here we're talking about institutions. So you start with a few institutions or players, and you start looking at their particular history. And as you start doing that, it helps you understand the networks and identify sort of other players that are affecting those changes, and thereby end up creating a much more broader network and write a history which then covers larger geographical areas and possibly the entire national boundary. So at this moment, I wouldn't sort of say that we'll be able to obviously say everything about the construction industry in all of India. Already trying to write that in terms of architecture is almost impossible. But so, of course, we'll start with some of those big players that we've talked about and try to understand both their historical development but also their historical influence to see how those things might have affected not just the regions that they operate in, but might have been emulated or have affected farther reaches of the country.
Well, Amit, thank you for coming to Architecture Talk.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.